Become somebody new in your team, it shouldn't take you 1 month to have them understand your setup. It implements industry current best practices, which in the front end changes quite often. And of course, it requires a strategy. So how do you come up with a good strategy to put your front end setup together? Well, you will want to, You will want to, well, ask a bunch of questions to a lot of people, because this is how you get a better idea of what you have to do and how to better do it. So there are 2 sets of questions that are pretty similar, but are asked to different people, right? So let's start with the what questions. And the what questions are to your client. And it's very important. It's essential you do this at a very early stage of the project. So the what questions for your client revolve around browser support, performance requirements, what HTTP protocol you envision you're going to be using, what accessibility, conformance, requirements you have, and analytics and testing strategy, E2E, or whatever you're going to be using, functional. And how do you envision us being more productive? This is a very important question. And then how do we achieve this are essentially the same questions, but for your team. Right? How do we achieve browser support and performance and et cetera, et cetera? And then once you have those questions answered, you have to go to the which questions. And the which questions are for probably the architects, the technical leads, the people that will put this setup together. First of all, you will ask yourself, based on the answers you got before, so which JS? Right? Which ECMAScript specification makes sense? Which framework makes sense? Which state manager? Which third-party APIs or third-party plugins you need to, I don't know, make analytics possible? Then you are going to ask yourself which CSS, which preprocessor. In 2018, I don't recommend anybody to go for pure CSS. So you're going to have a strategy with a preprocessor behind. You're going to ask yourself which build tools and setup, which bundlers, task runners, linters, coverage, loaders, plugins do we need? And finally, because we are talking about integrating with AEM, we're going to ask, what version of AEM are we going to work with? What new features do we want integrated that make sense for our clients? And what's our client library strategy going to look like? I don't know if everyone is familiar with client libraries. It's the pattern to work with front-end code in AEM. So if you have all these questions answered, you come with this win-win result matrix. And it allows you to have increased performance for authors, better user experience for users as well, for the end user of your clients. You also have enhanced productivity and flexibility for your team, right? Usually, large enterprise projects are distributed. You don't want to waste time on certain aspects. And also, you can guarantee and foster innovation and creativity. And this is super important, especially for front-end developers. It's one of the reasons of attrition. So you have to be very certain that you're providing the possibility to explore, to experiment, and to integrate new technologies. So let's go to a study case. And we have a standard AEM project. We have a components folder with the package inside. And because we said, hypothetically, that we want to have a modular client library strategy, and we are going to be shipping our code over HTTP2, we want to modularize as much as possible. So we're going to have a commons folder where we're going to have everything that is common, shared component, shared assets, perhaps dependencies. Then we're going to have our components folder. And in our components folder, we're going to have every component that we proxy, that we write custom from the beginning, as many as you wish, and probably the pages as well. So here is what the contents of each of these components is going to look like in terms of this modular strategy. We're going to have our client libraries folder inside of the component. The design package does not exist anymore in this scenario. And there we're going to have defined our category for each one of these components, both for author and for publish. And if we had, or we were using the style system as well, for example, we could potentially also encapsulate this front-end code in a specific folder with its specific category. So as you can see, we're already writing our JavaScript, and we're writing our CSS, and we have them with this particular pattern, components publish entry JS and component publish entry CSS. And for the author and whatever other client library would look exactly the same. So now we have all this in our mind. We can go to the tools and configuration. And yes, Webpack. Webpack is a module bundler, or it's super standard right now for front-end. It's likely you heard about it. There are alternatives, it's true. But I have to say that for the kind of projects AEM developers work with, the other alternatives advertise themselves as zero configuration. Even Webpack in its version 4 says we're zero configuration. But for the kind of setups we have, zero configuration is not the way we want to go. Because as many configurations as we have, the easier our lives and the better output we can produce. So it would be unfair we mention Webpack and we don't mention the underlying technologies, Node.js, of course. NPM also has alternatives. Until not long ago, there was a lot of debate whether NPM or Yarn were better, especially because Yarn had a deterministic approach, and NPM didn't implement that. Now NPM implements a log file, so it's no longer an issue. And it's also widely used in millions of repositories. It has a very active community, and you are likely to find what you need. Of course, using NPM packages or Node modules has a trade-off. In security, perhaps. It's something you have to discuss well, how you're going to ensure that you provide with this security layer. Probably putting your modules in a private repository in your Nexus, in your company, could work. So yes, why we need to implement this setup? Because, OK, we said we have this folder structure, and we wanted to iterate it or traverse it and collect some files that after some pattern that we're going to define or configure. And we need to load it, read it. We need to process this code. And finally, we need to output it to some designated target for AEM to extract it and maybe, perhaps, do some more operations to it. So this is a regular. You obviously make sure you have Node, you have NPM. In the long-term support version, if possible, or the latest long-term support version. And my proposal is that we create a front-end directory right below the component package, sorry. And yes, we're going to start installing all the dependencies that we need to process our code. So basically, because we made the decision, you didn't know it, but I made it, that we're going to be using ECMAScript 6, we are going to need some tools to transpile this ECMAScript 6 specification into something that most browsers can support. Because also our client said that we need to support a certain set of browsers. And for that, we're going to use Babel, which is a suite of plugins and loaders that help us do this. We are going to be transpiling our CSS preprocessed code. And for that, we also need loaders, because Webpack only understands JavaScript. And basically, we need to probably convert it to JavaScript, and then maybe reconvert it to CSS to extract it as a single file. We're going to do some linting, because like I said, we are huge teams. We are distributed. We sometimes are in different locations, sometimes across many time zones. And we don't want to be discussing for 3 days over a pull request, because one has an idea and the other has another. So we're going to enforce some conventions for the sake of time, and also because we want clean code. And for that, we have linters for styles and for ECMAScript. And we're going to try to have browser support starting from the code we write. And for that, we are going to implement this tool, AutoPrefixer, which makes sure that based on a configuration file that is called browser list RC, that is browser list plugin, you don't have to write all those vendor prefixes by hand. So you just pass a configuration of what browsers you're going to need to give support to, and it adds the vendor prefixes automatically. Browser list is also used by Babel. So it's a very useful configuration file and very powerful. And finally, we're going to have to perform minification and aggregation of JS and CSS. Maybe if in the end we continue with this modularization and this modular strategy, and we are over HTTP2, maybe we don't need to aggregate JS files or CSS, but maybe we do. In any case, we are going to need to minify and concatenate, because that's very important to save data over the wire for our users and even the authors, anybody loading our websites. And we're going to do that in AEM with Google Closure Compiler. And why we're choosing to do it in AEM? Because we cannot have two minification processes one after another. And the front-end code you write for your components or whatever features, it also needs to be put together with dependencies coming from AEM. And you're going to want to have this minification process once. So yes, how do you control this? You control it from the Felix configuration manager, from the system console, as called, from the HTML library manager. So you can also turn obfuscate to even optimize the output in terms of removing whatever you don't need. So yes, OK, we went all the way to AEM, but let's go back to Webpack. Webpack, especially now in the version 4, allows us to have several different modes. And we can write configuration files for every mode, and even not for the same mode, have them in different files and aggregate them. I do not recommend you extend yourself too much in separating configurations and putting them in different files, first of all, because you can end up overlapping yourself, and also because it would be a maintenance madness. So try to keep it per environment, for example, or per one for development and one for production that may serve other stages as well. And whatever other configurations would also go in this same path, like front-end, build, configuration. Webpack will pick it up by convention, so you don't have to write a lot about it. And finally, this package JSON, I think most of you may be familiar with it. It picks up this configuration, and it performs the necessary operations. You could have potentially a task runner to trigger whatever tasks are necessary and connect it to plugins and loaders. But you can also do it with a CLI from Webpack directly, running scripts directly. So yes, I was speaking about modes. This is maybe an opinion, personal opinion, but it's better to use, especially now in Webpack version 4, the modes directly from Webpack, because it helps you better cache this output. So yes, this is what the configuration file could potentially look like for an AEM setup. We're telling it, OK, so we have some entry files. This is the pattern. Just pick it up. Like in this case, entry file name ending would be entry, precisely. And then just do what you have to do with our loaders and plugins. And when it's the time, replace source by target and put the output there. What you also would want to do at this moment in time is edit the POM XML file and add the front-end plugin for Maven to make sure that every time you trigger a build from Maven, your front-end code is also executed. It's likely you will want to put it in your POM file in your components folder, so you don't have to wait for the front-end every time you run other parts of your project. You may also want to have some kind of synchronization tool that helps you, well, synchronize what you're doing during development with your server, let's say, without having to every time trigger a full build. So, for example, we use specific plugin that helps us, and it's things that you need to look at is, for example, that it has a window, so you are not constantly uploading new things. It also should have a mechanism of hashing or some other way to determine what needs to be re-uploaded and what not, because you don't want to be constantly exhausting your system with this kind of operations if they're not necessary. OK, and we said we were going to use ECMAScript 6, but AEM also has some dependencies on jQuery, even to this day. For example, everything that has to do with dialogues. And it can be that you are also consuming from other libraries that also use this framework or other. How do we make sure that our build doesn't break, that is not complaining about this syntax that doesn't understand or does not comply with our linters? Well, for example, let's suppose we have in our component, we have our component 1 underscore dialog.js, which is written in jQuery. We add it to our S-linked ignore. So again, we are leveraging configurations to make sure that whatever it's under, I don't know, bundle.js or no modules or dialog.js is not reprocessed and is not consuming time and resources. So how do we ship this code to the browser? Now we have an output, and the user is loading the page, and we have many different chunks of code or bundles. Of course, in HTTP 1, we will aggregate them and ship them as one single monolithic file. But in this scenario, using HTTP 2, we can, for example, via content policies, we could say, OK, if the front-end demo publish category, we're going to add it as the client library category that I want for this particular template. Let's say this is the base page template. So every time this template is loaded, this code is going to be requested. This considering that we don't have a design package in this scenario. Also because we want to leverage the latest features of AEM. But yeah, that's for the common dependencies that may be included in the head of the or at the beginning of the body tag. But then we have every component calling its own client library category or JS and CSS code on its own. We can leverage templates. We can use data slide call and define a client library category. We can even say, OK, send this author now to the author in WC mode edit, or this published when you're seeing the published page. And we can also be smarter and leverage asynchronous calls. They are not natively supported by the client libraries API. There is a tool out there that you can maybe explore. It's install it as a package in AEM, and it will allow you right on top of it and output scripts with different async or perhaps preload attributes. And then you are going to make sure that you are not blocking your HTML parsing with your JavaScript, which is one of the problems of page speed. But you can also implement a lazy loading technique. And thinking about these performance requirements we had coming from the client that we asked at the beginning, we can say, OK, let's have this performance budget, and let's say that everything that is above the fold that the client will, the customer will immediately see, I meant the user, the end user. Let's, for example, read it from the JS or CSS file and inline it directly in our component. We could even go further and have any image in the header be inlined as base 64. We can then lazy load anything that is below the fold with the preload or async attributes. And we can go even further with this lazy loading strategy and implement, for example, intersection of servers. So we have more control of this code being shipped to the browser really on demand. And this is one of the things every front-end developer has to live with, and everybody working in web. Obviously, not all of these APIs are readily available and supported by every browser. So you maybe have to implement a polyfill in case you have to support certain browsers. But yes, if you are lucky enough to be able to do this, then you can say, OK, you can implement the ratio property from the intersection of servers and say, OK, everything that is below the folder, if it is at a certain ratio of the viewport, start loading it. And if the user never gets there because it's never scrolling down, just never request it. OK. Lazy loading has a trade-off. There is also a trade-off to splitting your code in chunks that I will mention in a moment. But one of them is SEO. Of course, if the page is not rendered, you don't have anything to index. You can mitigate this with server-side rendering techniques. You can combine it with content fragments and experience fragments as well to create these rendered on the server pages and let the crawlers do their magic. But yeah, they're there. I'm not going to give you the exact recipe, but I'm going to tell you that you can do it. You have to investigate about it. And yes, the trade-off of having your code split in chunks is that when you have a larger file, compression ratio is higher. So you save on, perhaps if you're an HTTP2, on perception of loading, but you are going to be losing on compression ratio. So yes, loading via content policies, you can also load your additional styles, for example. And you can say, yes, OK, I want to have not only the client library that comes from the front-end demo homepage template policy, I also want to add these additional styles, particularly for this template. And that is always readily available. And then only if the user visits this particular template, I'm going to request this CSS. This is more useful also for components than for templates, but it's there to be done. And finally, for the front-end developers that are seeing this or will see it in the future, sometimes we don't want this to be controlled from the UI directly by the template authors. We want to create our strategies and have control over them so we can programmatically include this. This is obviously also possible. It's not right away obvious for us how the CRX repository and so on works, because we work on the other side of the stack. So it's always useful to use the UI, see how the data is structured, how the properties are structured, and create a content package and take a look at how this works. So later you can reuse these concepts programmatically. For example, here you could say, OK, for this policy, for the base page in its default, let's always load the client library category X and have it for your template. So thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Hello?
Hello.
One question, there I am. How do you get the generated code from the Webpack into AEM during the development cycle? I mean, you showed how to basically build a package from Maven with a runner, but I think during development you have a more direct way to pipe the generated output into AEM.
Yes, this comes also from configuration, and actually I didn't have enough time to think or extend myself over this, but when you define your configuration for development, you will do also a lot of things that maybe you don't want to do for production, which is minifying and trying to get your code as minimal as possible. And then, yes, like I was speaking about this hot deploy plugin that you can just get what actually changes and continuously integrate it to your development environment.
Is there an example project or something available?
Not at the moment, but we're working on one. It wasn't at a stage that I could share it with you today, but we're working on bringing all the new best practices to our own setup recommendation internally, and if possible, we're going to make it open source.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, you were talking about lazy loading. Mm-hmm. Were you able to get it to work on the author itself? Because we have the problem that the page is inside an iframe, mm-hmm. and it needs to be fully loaded before the author kicks in.
Yeah, not for the author, for the publisher.
OK, thank you anyway.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Any other questions? So if not, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.